system unbelievably, but unfortunately, there's certainly not a commitment to mental health in our whole society as general, and especially Utah. Well, not especially Utah, but just Utah included. I would say that we know that people who have committed suicide, their rates of utilization of the mental health system is just as bad before, is just as bad after. So they don't increase their utilization of the system. And the problem is they don't have access to it, they can't afford it, nor do they know how to even access it. So that's a huge problem.
We need to expand on that for sure. Homicides in Utah have soared over the last 10 years, significantly outpacing Utah's population growth. The CDC reports the homicide rate here in Utah is up 127%, with 2020 and 2021 ranking as the two most deadly years on record. And from every town for gun safety, Black Utahns are more likely than any other racial ethnic group to be killed by a gun homicide, 5 times more likely than white Utahns, 3 times for the Latino population. Back to you, Dr. Cheshire. Why do you think gun homicides disproportionately impact those groups?
They're disproportionately disenfranchised. They're disproportionately in poverty, and they're disproportionately discriminated against in this country in general and in Utah. So this has been well studied over many, many decades, and those are the root causes of increased gun violence in the Black community.
Do you think education is the key to fixing it?
No, I don't. We've tried to, it's like educating people not to be prejudiced. It's like educating a red zone away. It's like educating a whole area that's been disenfranchised. You have to actively, structurally change the governments and the policy making in order to fix those sorts of things. You know, there used to be a war against poverty in this country, and it was incredibly successful for the white population. Unfortunately, it just wasn't successful for the Black population because those rights just weren't afforded to them at that point.
Okay, that's not great. So, Nancy, what are the possible reasons, do you think, behind 2020 and 2021 being the deadliest on record? Do you think it was the pandemic?
Absolutely. What happened during the pandemic is people were fearful. We hadn't experienced anything like that in our lifetimes. And so, and when people are afraid, they often go out and buy guns. And the gun industry has actually marketed that way towards people's fears. And so it was very successful. For those 2 years, people went out in droves and bought guns. Those people we know were primarily people who had not owned guns before, so they were not well educated in gun ownership and safe storage and the kinds of things that you would hope responsible gun owners would know. And at the same time, here in Utah, we did away with the concealed carry permitting classes. And so a lot of those people that might have gotten trained otherwise didn't have to, and they didn't. So again, and when we talk to the police about this period of time and the soaring homicide rates, they said that a lot of those guns were stolen out of cars. So people were carrying the guns with them. They were inexperienced, they didn't store them safely, and they were stolen out of cars, and they ended up being used in crime.
Okay. Chris, what steps do you think that need to be taken by law enforcement agencies, policymakers in Utah to address these soaring homicide rates?
Well, homicide's obviously a complicated phenomenon. There's a lot of different things that lead to death, homicide deaths. One that we haven't mentioned so far, though, is that one of the leading forms of homicide in our country is in domestic violence. Violence between a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, etc. And I think that one step that we should be looking at is ways to try to get guns out of volatile domestic relationships. We have a system in place for establishing protective orders, but I think that the state legislature, states around the country, and Congress need to look into trying to provide better vehicles for removing guns from situations when a husband and a wife, a domestic partnership, are breaking up. That's one of of the most vulnerable times for women when, tensions are running high, people are, the couple is, feeling, hurt, and if a gun is there, a simple fight, a squabble can escalate to where somebody dies. We need to get guns better regulated and out of those situations.
Okay, Dr. Cheshire, I would love to hear your response to this, because same with suicide. If they have access to the gun, it's there. That's when it's being used, similar with domestic violence.
Yeah, I'm glad he brought up the situation. There are 1 million women in the United States who've been shot right now, and 70% of them were shot in a domestic violence situation. So that is a huge problem. Of course, having access to the gun allows you to use the gun, and the number one correlation of dying by gun violence is the presence of a gun. It's not mental health, which is what we tend to focus on when these sort of incidents happen. That's a very important issue. I wanted to talk about your idea of looking at the Constitution in a different way. That's a very important point, but we live in a system right now where the current Supreme Court interprets it as unfettered access. And in this country, historically, we've said, well, we're going to give broad access to guns, and on the margins, figure out who shouldn't have a gun. Whereas most societies and our Western peers, they want to limit guns for almost everybody and figure out on the margins who actually needs a gun. And we're actually one of the very few Western countries, at least, that has guns for protection. Most people, even in places like Switzerland and Iceland with higher gun rates, they don't have guns for protections. They have guns for hobby, sport, and hunting. And 50% of the guns bought in the U.S. are handguns for protections. So I think it's going to be tough to legalize ourselves out of this because historically we just aren't there, and currently the state of the Supreme Court isn't there to increase regulations, despite the fact that most people want them.
Do you think we're going to get there?
Well, so there's a lot of what you're saying that I agree with 100%. And the case that really paved the way for what you're talking about was the D.C. versus Heller decision back in the early 2000s, written by Justice Scalia. And it was a 5-4 decision, a very close decision. And it was the first time in over 200 years where the U.S. Supreme Court held that there was an individual right to bear arms for self-protection. Earlier decisions in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, had a very narrow reading of the Second Amendment. But it was only a 5-4 decision. But even in that case, in some of the more recent Supreme Court cases, there's a lot of dicta, language in the Supreme Court's decisions that say that safety regulations are still permissible, and part of that is still grounded in the well-regulated clause within the Second Amendment. And so I agree with you. It's a problem for us. We have a gun culture that is more enshrined in our basic laws than in virtually any other industrialized country in the world. And that's part of the reason that we're seeing thousands and thousands of people across the country dying needlessly. But my view is that we can't give up. There is space in the United States Constitution, quite a bit left, for us to find new and insightful ways to try to promote gun safety, and we have to keep on pushing. Why? Because the people that we love, the people we care about, they need us to take a leadership role in protecting their safety.
Okay, and switching topics on this, the Granite School District reported 28 weapon-related instances this school year compared to single-digit numbers before the pandemic. That number encompasses any tip relating to the possibility of a weapon on or near school grounds, whether the tip is founded or not. Utah Insight's Adeola gives us a look at the many ways district leaders are responding.
Ready?
I'll sit him down and kind of calm him down a little bit. I'll talk to him in a calm tone, take off his leash, and give him his search command.
What happens next is we see Bolt, well, do exactly what his name implies. Bolt into action.
He's capable of ways. He's actually listening to me.
Most of the time.
He's trained in German and Dutch. and he can definitely recognize my tones. He picks up on body language, emotions, tone, if something's serious, if it's not, if it's work time.
And right now, Bolt is on the clock, so to speak, racing against time to find a weapon that's unloaded for the sake of this demonstration in this school library.
He's going around trying to find the smell that he has associated a toy with. And once he does, then he tries to pinpoint it. And when he does, then he just locks up.
Ready for his reward.
We're still learning each other. So I'm still learning how to be able to read him.
Good boy. Now you need a little help.
As much as he's still learning what I want him to do. So it's a continuous process.
Like the Granite School District's ever-evolving efforts to keep everyone safe at school.
Complacency is not an option. So if there's a tool or a resource that's available to us, we're going to explore that with vigor and hopefully find a good balance that works for all of our schools.
Granite School District spokesperson Matt Sampson says lately there's been a spike in weapons and threats of weapons being brought to school in the district.
It's concerning because we're seeing incidents like this increase. We see more weapons-related incidences on our campus since before the pandemic, and we want to try and do what we can to try and stop this situation before it escalates or it gets any worse.
So far, district leaders say they've spent $50 million over the past 5 years on security upgrades, like a touchless scanner weapons detection system piloted first at Hunter High School. And the district's first gun detection canine unit focused solely on that purpose.
We can quickly deploy Officer Penrose and Bolt to one of our schools and have them search through that campus much quicker than it would take our officers in any type of traditional search.
While technology has provided a way to cut down the time it takes to communicate danger.
Seconds can save lives. Catapult EMS gives an ability for a teacher in any classroom to send an alert from their phone or from their email, which would also include like their GPS location. So say if they saw somebody suspicious, they can send that out, and that's an alert that goes out through the entire school. It then also goes to our site safety team who will evaluate that threat, but they're able to communicate with that. They can send a text message or an email and say, I'm secure, all of my students are in my classroom and accounted for. This is where I saw that person. And then everybody else can respond to that message within a school and also check in and provide like GPS locations. There's no one approach that's gonna magically solve any type of safety issue when it comes to school safety, student and staff safety. So we're looking at different strategies and different tools and resources that we can use.
Even just spreading the awareness of Bolt's presence in the district.
It's going to make people think twice about bringing things that they shouldn't have into the schools.
Good. Oh.
My whole goal is to prevent tragedy.
Reporting in Taylorsville, Liz Adeola for Utah Insight.
I also know that the odds are that it will happen here in the state of Utah someday. And I'm probably going to have to be the one to stand in front of those parents and look them in the eye. And it's going to be devastating if I can't, in good faith, say we tried to do something.
That was Governor Cox speaking about school shootings last year and basically saying it's when, not if. And we do know that schools are taking proactive measures. Nancy, do you think it's enough, or do they need to do more?
I think it's sad that we've gotten to this point where we have to have gun-sniffing dogs in schools. We have to have our kids go through metal detectors. I spend a lot of time talking to parents and students at tabling events that we do, and students are terrified by active shooter drills. You know, there's a mental health impact on our students that I think we can't ignore about these protective measures. And I would like to see us back it up and get those guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them ahead of all of that. So I would like to see better safe storage laws. We don't have durable safe storage laws here in Utah, and that could make a really big difference. We could do more to encourage gun owners to get biometric safes and locks, and lock their guns up and keep them away from students, so that students, I mean, most of those guns have been taken from the home. So it's, you know, it sort of falls on the parents to store those guns safely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. It's absurd, right, that we are having dogs sniff at our schools, security guards, policemen, more power to them, and metal detectors. It's absolutely absurd that we accept this. And I like what you said about the locks. I saw a statistic out of the CDC recently that said that if just half the people who currently don't have locks in their guns or safe places to put them had them, the gun violence rate would drop about 50%. So they just spent $50 million more in security. That could have bought hundreds of thousands of gun locks or hundreds of thousands of gun safes.
Or mental health.
Or a lot more mental health. I agree.
All those things I would rather see that money spent for,
So we've been seeing in the legislature that they're mostly expanding access to guns rather than gun control. Chris, how do you think we find that balance of keeping people safe versus infringing on their rights?
Well, I don't think that the governor can say in good faith that they've done anything that is going in the right direction toward trying to keep our kids safer. You know, back to the gun lock point, we as a country have done a lot to try to make our guns more lethal and more broadly accessible. In comparison to the old flintlock muskets that the Second Amendment was talking about, now we have widespread assault rifles, large clips, machine guns, etc. But at the same time that we've had enormous advances in our technology. You know, if I want to make a phone call on my phone, I have to have a biometric recognition, either of my face or my thumbprint every time I want to send a text message. But if I want to take out a gun or have a gun that's available for a child to shoot somebody, we don't have anything along those lines in terms of biometric recognition. That's an area where we could continue to have guns available, as some folks in our community want, but where we could use emerging technologies to better protect children.
Okay, and Dr. Cheshire, I wanted to talk to you about the mental health aspect. I know that parents and kids are scared to they're scared to go to school. Parents are scared to send their kids to school. How can we get through this? Like, I know it is scary going through, a detector and having all of those things. It's got to be playing an impact on their mental health.
Yeah, I mean, so logically, there's two things you can do. You can provide more mental health resources for them, in-school counselors, and resources of that nature for them to deal with the situation. Or the other logical thing to do is, like she said, just sort of back up on all of that and start doing more constructive things that will actually reduce the gun violence in the first place.
Keeping guns out of unsafe hands.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've got to do a better job of that. And you touched on the crisis intervention orders, the extreme risk protection orders. That is a really good law that could save a lot of lives here in Utah. It touches on, I think, the three things that people are, our two biggest problems: gun suicide and domestic violence homicide. And it also has been very effective at heading off mass shootings. So, and there's federal money for that now. So there's really no reason. 19 states have adopted that. It has a long track record. There's in some states it's been used for 20 years. So there's a lot of data that shows, and especially with suicides, it's very successful law.
I think those laws need to be implemented in the appropriate way. For instance, there was a red flag law that should have stopped the shooter in Buffalo, but it did not. And people look at that as a criticism against those red flag type of laws, when the reality was a year before that person was actually attempting suicide and attempting to kill others, and he got put in by the police. And for whatever reason, the police didn't put the red flag all in. But the red flag law was actually quite new, so the policemen may not have been informed. And where it looks like they work the best is when there's specific parts of the police department that are trying to enforce those red flag laws. There's specific programs within them. So I would hope that the state legislator gets on board with that, but I hope that they would implement those laws in a proper way, that they're actually effective.
Yeah, there needs to be a lot of education in the system, not just with the police, but also with the health community about how to implement those laws and effectively.
Okay, and we are almost out of time, but I do want to give you 30 seconds, Nancy, to talk about what's going on with the tool on the desk.
Yeah, so I brought a prop. This used to be a gun. We have an event this Saturday from 9 until noon at Christ United Methodist Church on 33rd South. And what we do is we take guns that are no longer wanted or being used, and people feel like they might be a liability in their home. They want to make sure that they are not going to get into the wrong hands. This was the barrel of a gun, and it was flattened out, and this was the stock of a rifle. And we send the parts to Raw Tools in Colorado, and they make these beautiful garden tools. If you can see the detail there.
Thank you. I'm glad we got that in.
Yeah,
and we are out of time. It goes by so fast, especially with these deep topics. So thank you so much for being here. Another important topic discussed, and we will see you back here next week.